Hey y'all, today we're going to be talking about cells. So cells are the building blocks of life, and we say this because all living things are made up of cells. Whether it's a tree, whether it's you, whether it's the bacteria, right? All of these things are made up of at least one cell. Now, when we think about cells, we think about putting them in different groups because the difference between a tree, you, and a bacteria are pretty different. So it makes sense that the structure of these are going to be different. Let's first think about animals and plants because they're the ones that we can see easiest and we can think about pretty easy. So animals and plants, we put them together and we call them eukaryotic cells. The easiest way to remember this is you are eukaryotic. So animal and plant cells have very similar structures. A few differences though. So let's first look at the similarities and then we can look at what makes them different. So similarities, they're very similar in size. Plant cells are a little bit larger usually, but generally speaking, they're pretty close in size. Both of them have a nucleus. Now, the nucleus is inside there. It's where we store all of the genetic information, all of those instructions on what makes a cell, or what makes an organism an organism. So for example, if we were to think about you, if we were to take a cell from your body, just a normal cell, let's say a skin cell, inside it, we would find the nucleus. And if we looked inside that nucleus and pulled out the information inside there, it would be the instructions of everything that makes you you. So inside the nucleus, we store all the genetic information, and this is the same in most plant and animal cells. Another thing that's similar is they all have a cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane, it's kind of like the fence around the outside, letting things in and out. It controls what's allowed to come in and out of these cells. That's important, that's needed, because if we didn't have something controlling what was coming in and out, the cell wouldn't be able to function. We'd have things that get in that we don't want in, and we'd be having things leave that we actually need to stay inside there. So both of them have cell membranes. Other things that they have that are similar is inside this cell, we have a lot of empty space, right? In that space, we fill it with this gel-like substance that's called cytoplasm. And in plants and animals, both of these have this cytoplasm. It's in there, one, to help kind of fill up that empty space and to hold all of the nutrients, everything that we need in there. It's also the place where any chemical reactions are going to be taking place. Okay, so if we think about reactions happening inside a cell, most likely they're happening inside the cytoplasm. This is where the majority of things happen. Other things that are going to be similar between them, they both have mitochondria. Now, the most common thing we hear people say is that it's the mighty mitochondria, or that it's the powerhouse of the cell. This is true. So the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, but what does that mean? What it means is the mitochondria is where we do respiration. Now, respiration is not breathing in and breathing out. Respiration is taking food and turning that into energy. So inside the mitochondria of plant cells and animal cells, we take all the food that's in there. We turn it into energy that's able to be used by the cell or by the organism. Okay, so we can think about the mitochondria. It's kind of like that engine that keeps taking in that fuel, turning it into something that we can use, and producing energy for the rest of the cell. All right? Other things that are similar in there is plant and animal cells both have ribosomes. Now, when I think about ribosomes, I'm from Texas, y'all, so I think about ribosomes, I think about ribs. Ribs are a big type of meat. That's kind of what ribosomes are there for. Ribosomes make proteins. They make proteins, and proteins go out into the world. One of the things they do is to replace and help us grow in muscles, right? So ribosomes make proteins. Proteins then go out into the world. They're there for growth, repair, any of these things that are needed either within the cell or in the wider organism. So ribosomes, we think ribs. They make protein. Mitochondria, powerhouse. It takes in that food and it turns it into energy. The nucleus, it's where we're storing all of the information, all of the instructions, all of that genetic material that tells a cell or an organism what it's going to be. Cytoplasm, it's the gel-like, that plasm, it's that gel inside there where all of those reactions take place. And the cell membrane, it's the thing that goes all the way around it and allows things in and out. It's kind of the thing that's controlling entry and exit. Those are those most common similarities between animal and plant cells. So as I think about the similarities, it makes me think, what differences are there? Well, if we stop and think, what's the difference between an animal and a plant? Plants do photosynthesis. Animals don't, mostly. So if plants do photosynthesis and animals don't, that's probably where we're going to see the majority of the differences. Well, one of the big organelles that are different between an animal and a plant cell is a chloroplast. Plants have chloroplasts. Now, what this is it looks similar to the mitochondria in structure and size, but it takes in sunlight from the sun, does photosynthesis using chlorophyll. Now, new word, I'm going to come back to that. But it takes in that sunlight, does photosynthesis, turns it into sugar. Very simple. Now, chlorophyll, I just mentioned it a minute ago. First thing, way we remember that is chloroplast is filled with chlorophyll. The chloro is the same, fill is in the stuff that actually is filling the chloroplast. And all that is it's a pigment or a substance, a chemical that's in there that's green in color, and it's used to absorb all of the energy from the sun. All of those wavelengths that come in, it's trying to absorb those to be able to have energy to do photosynthesis. And it stays inside the chloroplast. So that's one big organelle that's different inside a plant that's not inside an animal. A few others, we have two more we're going to talk about. The next one is the vacuole. Now, permanent vacuole is the way we want to refer to them, but you can get away with saying vacuole for the most part. Now, permanent vacuole, we don't find these in animal cells either, typically. And what they are, it's kind of like a really big storage tank. So if I'm a cell that's in a plant, and the one thing that I'm really doing a lot of is photosynthesis, I need to have a place to do photosynthesis. Good, we have the chloroplast for that. I also need somewhere where I can store all of those materials that I might need or that I make as I'm doing photosynthesis. And that's the whole thing with the vacuole. The permanent vacuole is there as a big storage tank so we can store sap inside it, which is just liquid with the sugars dissolved into it or any of those nutrients that we're going to need inside there. So permanent vacuole, storage tank. Last thing that's going to be the main difference between animal and plant cells is the cell wall. Now, when we think about animals, think about yourself, your body's made up of a skeletal system. We have bones all over. We can think about a different type of animal like a crab, for example. They have a shell. These are the things that help give them structure and support as an organism. If you think about a tree doesn't have a shell. It doesn't have bones. If you think about a flower, it doesn't have a shell. It doesn't have bones. Instead, they have cell walls. And what is a cell wall? It's the walls of the cell. It is just like the cell membrane in that it goes all the way around the cell. But the difference being, it's not there to just hold things in or out. It's there to keep support. It's there to hold it together and hold it nice and big so that way it can keep its structure. Now, inside the plant cell, what we see sometimes is if it starts to get dry, it starts to lose some of the water inside there and it could shrivel up. That cell wall is there to help it keep its structure even when it has a little less water in there. Where an animal cell, if you take some of that water out, it's going to shrivel up. The plant cell is going to fight to keep its structure more. If we start to fill a lot of extra in there, that cell wall is going to be in there to help keep it rigid, keep it from bursting, try and help maintain its structure a little bit more than we'd see in an animal cell. So our three organelles that are different inside the plant cell, cell wall. It's the walls of the cell. It keeps its structure, holds it together. Chloroplasts, photosynthesis. It's the green little structures that take in the sunlight, do photosynthesis to help us make sugar. 3, vacuole. It's the storage container. It holds sap, holds all of the things that that plant cell might need to be able to carry out its functions or do photosynthesis. Now, first group we talked about was eukaryotes. Right? We talked about you being a eukaryote, and it's made up of animal and plant cells. We talked about some of the structures, or organelles as we refer to them, that are common in them. We talked about some of the organelles that are different. And remember, when we think about the different organelles, for now, we're only thinking about things that plants have that animals don't. Animals, as far as we're worrying about right now, have all of the same organelles that a plant cell would typically have, but the plant cells have those 3 extra ones. Now, let's think about our other group. At the very beginning, when I talked about cells being living things, I talked about you, a plant, and bacteria. Let's go back to that third group, that bacteria group. When we think about these cells, we call them prokaryotes, right? That's the name that we give them. So we have eukaryotes, which are animal and plant, and prokaryotes, which are our bacteria group. Now, what do we think about when we think about bacteria? We think about small organisms, right? We don't see them. We don't think about seeing them ever because they're so small. Good, that helps us out because prokaryotic cells tend to be much smaller than our eukaryotic cells. They're a lot smaller than that, right? Other differences they have, if they're much smaller, if we think about all those organelles that we talked about inside animal and plant cells, we're not going to be able to fit all of those things inside a much smaller cell, inside the prokaryotic cell. So they don't have organelles that are membrane bound or surrounded by their own membrane, right? They don't have a nucleus. They're not going to have a mitochondria inside them. They're too small. It wouldn't fit inside there, okay? They do have ribosomes inside them. They also have DNA. Now, when we talked about the nucleus, we talked about how it holds the genetic information, the instructions for the cell and for the organism. Well, a bacteria, as a living thing, needs its own instructions. It needs its own DNA. So the DNA there, since it can't be stored in a nucleus because the nucleus would be too big, it's stored in one single-stranded loop. Okay? We also take other small pieces of DNA and we store them in plasmids inside there. So inside an animal or a plant cell, if I'm looking for the instructions, looking for the DNA, I'm going to find the nucleus. All of them are going to be inside there, stored in some fashion depending on what animal or plant it is. If I'm looking for a bacteria, I'm going to try and find their single-stranded loop DNA, and I'm going to try and find their plasmid because that's where all their instructions are. Okay? So, big differences between the eukaryotic and prokaryotic. Prokaryotic, much smaller. They don't have a nucleus, they have plasmids, and they have a single loop DNA. Two of them have to do with DNA, one of them have to do with their size. All right, that's all we have for today. Come back next lesson and we'll explore a little bit more about cells, some of their structural differences, some of the differences that we can see.